I have kept the table of Cenaris for 61 years, and in all that time I never once thought about the chairs. That is not a small confession. The keeper of the table is the officer who counts the settings, who knows which of the 411 noble houses may not be seated within reach of which other, who knows that Lady Ossen will not eat from silver, and that the Margrave of the Cold Coast will not eat at all if there is fish in the room. I have moved wars around a dinner. I have made peace between two river provinces by putting their heirs on the same bench and giving them a shared platter of roast fowl, because it is very difficult to hate a man whose hand is in the same dish as yours. I knew where every chair in the palace stood. I ordered them polished. I ordered them counted. I never once thought about what a chair is for. A human taught me. He did not mean to. He was a cook, and he was cooking, and I was standing in the doorway of my own kitchen with my mouth open like a fish, and afterward the whole shape of my life had a different set of walls in it. I should begin properly. My name is Ovid Sarun, of the third house of Sarun, which is a very fine old house with no money and a great deal of hallway. I am Vesing, as our ascendancy is Vesing, and I look as we all look, the long hands, the pale lavender of the skin at my wrists gone waxy with age, the low glow at the corners of my eyes that dims as we get old, the way a lamp dims when the oil is thinning. I am told by humans that my ears are startling. I am told by humans a great many things. In those days, I did not listen to any of them, because I had been raised in the belief that the Vesing were the mind of the galaxy and everything else was the weather. And I should say what the maid are, because if you do not understand that, you will not understand what the cook did. 11 generations ago a wasting came through the imperial blood. It took the fathers and the mothers, and it took the wombs and left the throne standing empty in a hall full of living people. So our physicians did what our physicians do, which is to solve. They built the quiet rooms beneath the west wing of Cenaris, and in the quiet rooms they grew heirs. Not infants. Infants are inefficient. Infants take 12 years to become useful and might die of a cough in the third. They grew them ready. They grew them to the age the throne required, and then they decanted them into the world with their hair already grown and their nails already needing trimming, and they gave them the histories they were required to have, and the court bowed. I have seen 4 decantings in my life. It is not a horror. That is the part people misunderstand. There is no screaming, no thrashing thing in a tank. There is a long, warm room the color of milk, and there is a slow draining of fluid, and then there is a child sitting up on a table with wet hair, blinking, looking at his own hands. It is very quiet. That is where the name comes from. The maid are not slaves. They wear the crown. They rule. 3 of the last 5 empresses were made, and one of them, Ilverin the Elder, is on our coins. But there is a thing the court does with its mouth when it speaks of them, a thing I did with my own mouth for 6 decades. We say sustained instead of fed. We say quieted instead of asleep. We say unmade instead of the other word. And if you ask any physician of the ascendancy whether a made child hungers, he will tell you patiently, as to a slow student, that the made do not hunger. They are sustained by draught. Hunger is an animal error. The maid are past it. I believed that. I want to be very clear that I believed it, because I would rather be a fool in this account than a liar. Prince Tayan was decanted at 9 years old on the 2nd day of the Ember fast, in the 9th year of Empress Ilverin the Younger, who had no child of her body and never would, and who had waited 11 years for the quiet rooms to make her one. He came out perfect. That was in every report. His limbs were sound, his eyes had the right glow, the small ridge of his crown bone had come in cleanly under the hair, his hands were long and fine and Vesing and beautiful. The high physician, Marun Ist, wrote in his own hand that the boy was without deficiency. I read that document. It hangs now, framed, in a room where the boy's descendants will see it, because he insisted, because he says people should be able to see exactly how wrong we were, and in what handwriting. The trouble started on the 6th day. He did not take the sustaining draught. It is given through a reed of soft glass, warm with a flavoring of the mineral salts our children like. He turned his head. Not violently. The maid are never violent. They have no reason to be. Nothing has ever hurt them. He simply turned his head and the reed touched his cheek, and the draft ran down his jaw and onto the linen, and Warden Seth wiped it and tried again, and he turned his head again. They tried for a month. They warmed it. They cooled it. They changed the salts. They brought a second physician, then a third. Then the College of the Inner Sea sent 2 men who had written the standard text on decantshot, and they were in the West Wing for 9 days and left looking as if they had been asked to prove that water is dry. He never spoke. That was the other thing. The maids speak on the first day always. The language is laid in with everything else, and the standard first sentence is a formality, a small phrase about being ready to serve, and every decanting I ever attended, the child said it, sitting on the table with wet hair. Tayan sat on the table with wet hair and looked at Marun Ist for a long time and did not say anything at all. And Marun Ist wrote initial silence, non-pathological, and went to his supper. By the middle of that first year, the boy was going still. I had never seen a stilling. Everyone in the palace had heard of it. When a maid goes still, they do not sicken exactly. They slow. They stop turning their head toward doors. They will sit where you place them for hours, and their eyes are open and their breath is even and there is nothing at all behind the glass. And then one morning the glow at the corners of the eyes has gone out, and there is a body in the chair. They tried everything the ascendancy had. Tutors. There were 11 tutors, and each one lasted between 4 days and a season. Physicians. 9, and then the convocation forbade a 10th on grounds of dignity. Nurse. Wardens. I could not tell you the number. There was music brought from 3 provinces, and a machine that made a sound like a heart, and a woman from the cold coast who claimed she could sing a maid into wanting, and who sang for 6 hours, and then wept into her hands in my corridor while I stood there with my arms folded like a door. And there was the Empress. Understand, Ilverin was not permitted to touch him. It is not cruelty, it is protocol, and protocol is only cruelty that has been in the building a long time. The maid heir is not the Empress's child until his investiture. Before that he belongs to the quiet rooms, and the rooms belong to the college. She could observe him. She did, every day from the gallery above the West Solar, standing at the rail with her hands laid one on the other, in a gown of crystal thread that whispered when she breathed. She was 39 years old that year. She had the most beautiful face in the ascendancy, and it did nothing, ever at all. And I mistook that for coldness for 11 years, and it was not coldness. It was a woman standing very still because she had discovered that if she moved she would break. Once, this is the thing I did not put in any report. Once I came into the gallery to bring her the seating for the fast, and she had her hand through the rail, reaching down toward the solar floor where the boy sat on a rug with his back to us, and there were 4 meters of air between her fingers and the top of his head, and she was not aware of me, and I backed out and shut the door and stood in the hall and thought, the keeper of the table has no business here. In the second year, the convocation of 9 met to consider the unmaking. I attended. I stood at the back with the household officers, holding the tally book I did not need, and I listened to reasonable men speak reasonably. The heir was defective. This was not his fault. Nothing about him was his fault, since fault requires a person, and what sat in the West Solar was a very expensive arrangement of the correct materials. The quiet rooms could begin again within the month. There would be a period of mourning, formally observed, out of respect for the resources involved. The Empress would be given a new heir at the age of 11, which several of the physicians felt was a superior age for the work, and Marun Ist observed that they had learned much, and the next one would be better. The vote was 7-2. The unmaking was set for the turning of the year, which gave us 5 months. The Empress was told in the afternoon. She said, "Thank you, my lords," and went to the gallery and stood at the rail until dark. And below all of that, 4 floors below, under the west wing, in a barrel-vaulted room with a floor of scorched brick, and a chimney that has drawn badly since before my grandfather held this office. The low kitchen went on cooking for 200 servants, because whatever else is happening, servants eat. That is where the human was. We had had humans in the palace for 19 years by then, since the Accord, a few hundred of them across the household, doing the work that the vessel of the household would not do and that machines do badly, which is more work than anyone expects. Humans are cheap. That was the reasoning in the memoranda. They are cheap and they are strong for their size and they do not mind heat. They are also, and I wrote this myself in a report to the Lord Chamberlain, disorderly, overfamiliar, and inclined to touch surfaces. They smell. I will say it plainly because I said it plainly then at table and made people laugh. They smell of onion and of smoke and of their own skin. They have that thick, clumsy skin that heals in ridges, and their hands are short and wide and they use them constantly, on everything, on door frames as they pass, on each other's shoulders, on the shoulders of Vessin, which caused 3 formal complaints in my first year of supervising them. They laugh in the middle of work. They sing badly and often. They eat standing up and they eat sitting down and they eat while walking down a corridor. And I once saw a human groundsman eat a piece of bread while holding a ladder for another human. And I remember thinking that they were a species entirely composed of appetite, and that this was the reason they had never built anything. They had built a fleet that fought us to a standstill over the Marrow Belt, but I did not think about that at dinner. Nate Corliss came to us in the spring of the 2nd year. I have his intake sheet. Human male, 33 standard years, colony-born, prior service. Line cook and then galley master on a bulk hauler and before that a farm. Trade, soup, bread, plain roast. Marks, burn scars on both forearms, ridged, old. Contract, 7 years, wage paid in part to a sister on a colony I had never heard of, 3/4 of it, every month, which I noticed only because it was an odd number on a form. He was not large. That surprises people who hear this story. He was of ordinary human height, which is to say he came to my collarbone, and he was thick through the chest and shoulders in the way of men who have carried things all their lives, and he had a broad, flat face, and eyes the color of wet stone, and hair he cut himself badly with kitchen shears. He walked like a man on a ship. He had a wooden spoon. I want to describe the spoon because it matters more to this history than the convocation of 9. It was oak, gone dark, the bowl of it worn to an oval on the left side because he stirred left-handed, and the handle had a shine on it like a stair rail in an old house. He carried it through his belt. He had it made, he told me later, by his grandmother's brother, who was a joiner, and it had been in a hauler's galley for 11 years and a farm kitchen before that. And once a purser tried to throw it out, and Corliss went into the waste bin to the shoulders and came out with it and said nothing to anybody. He also had a pot, chipped enamel, white gone gray, which was not palace property and which he was not supposed to use, and which I permitted because it was easier than arguing with a man who simply kept doing the thing while apologizing for it. The first time I spoke to him, I had come down to reprimand the whole kitchen because a tray had gone up to the household hall with a scorched crust, and I stood in the doorway of the low kitchen with my hands behind my back, and I said what a keeper of the table says, which is a great deal of nothing, elegantly. The human staff stood along the bench with their heads down. The Vessin undercook stood with their heads up, which is its own kind of insolence. Corliss was at the end of the room with his back to me, stirring. When I finished, he turned around and wiped his hand on his apron and said, "That was mine. The crust. I had the oven too hot because the flues fouled, and I should have dropped the fire and I got proud instead." He looked at me the way a man looks at a wall he is thinking about painting. "I can climb up there and clean it out on my rest day if you'll have somebody hold the ladder." Nobody in that kitchen had ever confessed to me in 60 years. I said, "The chimney has been fouled since before you were born." "Yeah," he said, "that do it." He cleaned it on his rest day. It took him 9 hours and he came out of it black to the elbows and coughing, and the low kitchen drew properly for the first time in a century and a half, and no one ever put it in a report, and I certainly did not, because who would I have told and what would I have said? A human went up the chimney. They would have said, yes, they are good for that. Now I come to the part I have to tell carefully. The maid heir was not confined. Nobody thought to confine him. What would he do? He sat where he was placed. So at night, when the warden had gone and the solar was dark and the corridor lamps had been turned to their low burn, the boy went walking. He had been doing it for months. I know that now. Guards saw him and did not report it because what is there to report? The heir is in the palace. A maid saw him on the third stair and curtsied to a boy who did not see her. He walked the way water walks downhill, and every stair in Scenaris that goes down and keeps going down eventually arrives at the same place, because a palace is built the way a body is built, and the kitchen is the stomach and everything drains toward it. Corliss worked late. The servants' hall eats after everyone else, and then the bread has to be set for morning, and he did it himself, the way a certain kind of man does things himself. He would bank the fire and set the dough and sit down on the bench with a bowl of whatever had not gone up, and eat it alone at the long scarred table with a lamp at his elbow. The boy came down on a night in the 7th month and stood in the doorway. I have made Corliss tell it 4 times. He is not good at telling it. He says, he was just standing there, and then he stops and looks uncomfortable, and I have to prod him along like a man dragging a cart out of mud. He says the boy was in a nightshirt of white linen with the imperial thread at the hem. He says the boy's feet were bare and dirty on the soles from the corridors, which nobody had noticed for months. He says the boy's face was, and here Corliss always uses the same word, and it is not a word from any court, empty, like a house with the lights off. He says the boy looked at the lamp and at the pot and at Corliss. And Corliss, who had been in the palace 11 weeks, who had been told at his intake that the heir was in the west wing and not to be looked at and not to be spoken to, and that the maid were sustained and did not eat, stood up. He did not kneel. That has been discussed at some length in later years. There is a school that holds it was a deliberate act of philosophy. There is a school that holds it was insolence and that we are lucky it happened. I asked him once directly why he had not gone to his knees before the heir of the Vessane ascendancy, and he thought about it for a while, and he said, because I had a pot in my hand. He said, you hungry? The boy did not answer. He had not spoken in 2 years. So Corliss did what he had done every night of his working life, which was to take a second bowl down from the shelf, and set it on the table across from his own, and pull out the chair. That was all. That was the whole of it. That is the act that is carved now on the wall of the servants' stair in a script that is deliberately plain, and half the people who read it do not understand why anyone bothered, and the other half stop walking. He ladled soup, barley, the fat still on it, an onion in it and a bone that had been in 3 days' worth of soup already, and he put the bowl down and he sat and he began to eat his own, because, he said, you don't watch a man eat. And after a while, the prince of the Vessane, who was going still, who no reed of soft glass could reach, came across the brick and got up on the chair and picked up the spoon in his fist like a child of 4 and put barley soup in his mouth. Corliss did not look up. That is what he says. He says he kept eating his own soup, and he said something about the weather, which is idiotic, because there is no weather 4 floors under a palace. And he says he knew that even as he said it, and he said it anyway because the silence needed something in it. The boy ate 2 bowls. Then he got down and walked out and up the stairs, and Corliss washed both bowls and set the dough and went to bed. He did not report it. I asked him why. He said, report what? He said, a kid came in and ate. For 11 weeks it went on, and nobody knew. Every night. Sometimes early, sometimes so late that Corliss had fallen asleep with his head on his arms and woke to find the boy standing there patiently in the dark. He never knocked. He had no word for the thing you do when you arrive. And Corliss put him to work. That is what I cannot get past, even now, even after everything. Any Vessing in the ascendancy who found the imperial heir in his kitchen would have done one of two things: run for the guard or fallen down. Corliss handed him a spoon. He said, "Stir that slow. Don't beat it, you're not fighting it." He said, "Hold this board still with both hands. That's the job. Don't move it. That's a real job, that's not me being nice to you." He said, "You tear the bread." I got hands like feet, look at that, that's not a piece of bread, that's a disaster. Yours are better, go on. The maid heir of the Vessing ascendancy stood on a wooden crate at a scorched brick hearth in a nightshirt with dirty feet, and stirred barley soup with a joiner's oak spoon, slowly, not beating it, while a human talked at him about nothing. And this is what a Vessing cannot understand, and I have had to learn like a language in old age. The talking was the whole medicine. Corliss talked about his sister's farm, where the ground freezes so hard in winter that they store the meat in a hole and the hole is safer than any lock, and about a purser on a hauler who tried to throw away his spoon, and about the correct way to know when bread is done, which is to knock on the bottom of the loaf and listen. And he made the boy knock on the bottom of a loaf and listen, and he said, "Hear that? That's hollow. That's the sound of done." He talked about how the flue had been fouled and how proud he'd been about the crust and how pride ruins more bread than fire does. He talked about a burn on his forearm, the long ridged one, and he said, "That's from 22 years old and thinking I could carry a full pan one-handed, and now I'm 33 and I use two hands, and that's the entire story of being a cook." He asked the boy questions and did not wait for answers, and did not act as though a missing answer was a wound. He said one night in the 9th week, holding out a heel of bread, "You want this or you don't want it. Both are fine. But somebody's got to eat it, that's the rule of this kitchen." And the boy said, "Why?" Corliss says he nearly dropped the bread. He says he did not make a fuss. He says he understood immediately, the way you understand a bird has landed on your arm, that any sudden movement ends it. He says he took a breath and he said, "Because it took 4 hours in somebody's hands, and if it goes in the bin then all of that went in the bin too. Food's not just food. It's the time somebody spent." The boy considered this, then he ate the bread. Then he said, "What is your name?" "Nate," said the cook and put out his hand, and the prince of the Vessing looked at it for a while, because nobody had ever offered him a hand, and then he took it, and they shook gravely like two men agreeing on the price of a horse. In the 11th week the boy spoke a full sentence. It was, "I do not like the fat on it." He said it with his face perfectly still, the way the maids say everything, and Corliss says he laughed so hard he had to hold the edge of the table, and the boy watched him laugh, and then, this is the part Corliss tells last, and quietly the boy's face moved. Not a smile as we would draw it, a movement. Something arriving from a long way off and finding the door open. Corliss skimmed the fat off from that night on. He never once said, "The heir prefers the soup skimmed." He said, "The kid doesn't like the fat." I found them on a night in the 11th week, because the bread was late. That was the reason. The household hall's bread had gone up a half hour past the hour twice, and the keeper of the table does not permit a half hour. And I came down the servant's stair at an unreasonable time in the night with a lamp in my hand to be unpleasant to a human, and I stopped on the 7th step because I could hear voices in my kitchen. One was the human, the other was a child's, and there are no children in the household. I came down 2 more steps and I looked through the rail, and I saw the low kitchen with one lamp lit and the fire banked to a red eye, and the long scarred table, and on the far side of the table, kneeling up on a chair with his elbows on the wood, the heir of the ascendancy, with flour to the wrists. The human was rolling out dough. He said something. The boy answered him. The human said, "That's because you're pushing down instead of out. Push away from you. Lean on it, it's not going to break." And the boy leaned on it with his whole small weight, and the dough went out flat under his hands, and he looked up at the human with his mouth open, and the low glow at the corners of his eyes, which I had last seen fatting, which the physicians had measured weekly and charted downward on a graph that hangs in the college to this day, was bright enough to lay a shadow. I dropped my lamp. I do not remember deciding anything. I remember shouting, and I remember the human turning around with his hands full of dough and his face going through surprise into something else, something I did not read at the time and have thought about for 30 years, which was not fear for himself. I remember the guard coming. I remember Captain Orun taking the boy up by the arms, and the boy, who had never resisted anything, never once, not the reed, not the tutors, not the hands that moved him from chair to chair. The boy set his feet on the brick and pulled backward and screamed. He screamed the human's name, 2 syllables over and over in a voice nobody in that palace had ever heard, and Corliss stood absolutely still with dough on his hands and said in a completely level tone, "Tayan, go with them. It's all right. Go on now, I'm right here." And the boy stopped fighting and went, looking back over his shoulder the whole way up the stair, and the human stood in my kitchen and said nothing, and did not defend himself, and did not appeal to me, and after a moment he began, mechanically, to scrape the dough off his hands. I said things to him that I will not repeat. I want to. I have thought that a full account requires them, but my granddaughter reads what I write, and she has a human at her table twice a week, and I find that I cannot put my own words down in ink where she will see them. The substance of it was filth, contamination, that he had fed offal to the imperial heir out of a bin with his hands, that the maid are sustained and do not eat, and that whatever he had put in that child's body would have to be answered for by his physicians, and that he was a human, that he was a human, that he was a human, and I said that word the way you would use a tool. And Nate Corliss listened to all of it with his eyes on the floor, and when I was finished, he looked up and he said, "He was hungry, sir." He was dismissed within the hour. The Lord Chamberlain's order on my recommendation, at my hand, in my writing, conduct prejudicial to the person of the heir. No violence was done to him. I insisted on that, and I have taken a certain amount of comfort from it over the years, and the comfort is not worth much. He was walked out of the low kitchen gate before dawn with his contract voided, his 3/4 wage stopped, no character, no reference, no letter, and 1 canvas roll containing an apron, 2 shirts, a chipped enamel pot, and an oak spoon. The guards did not permit him to go back for the bread that was proving on the shelf. He asked. That is in the guard's own report, in a tone of bafflement. The human requested to return to complete the morning bread and was refused. He slept that night against the wall of the spice market at the foot of the palace hill, in the cold, and in the morning he went down to the docks, where there is always work for a man who can feed 40 people out of 1 pot, and he cooked for dockhands and hull scrapers for 4.5 months, and he never once, in all that time, told a living soul who the child in his kitchen had been. We know this because when it all came out, the dockhands were interviewed. They said the human cook was a quiet man who fed anybody who sat down. They said he skimmed the fat off, which was strange because dockhands liked the fat, and when they asked him why, he said he'd got in the habit and left it there. The boy went still. Not slowly. That is what broke the college. The stilling was understood to be a gradient, a long sad slope, and Prince Tayan went off it like a man off a roof. 9 days after the human left the palace, Warden Seth found him in the West Solar in the morning exactly as she had left him at night, in the same posture, and he had not moved at all, and he did not turn his head toward the door, and he did not turn it toward her voice, and the glow at the corners of his eyes was the color of a lamp with the oil gone. He would not take the draught. He would not take water. He did not speak, and he never said the human's name again to any of us, not once, though I am told he said it in his sleep, and Warden Seth, who was a hard woman with 40 years in the rooms and no gift for softness, told me that afterward with her hands over her face. The convocation moved the unmaking forward. There was a reason given, and the reason was mercy, and the reason was not entirely a lie, And that is the worst thing about it. To let a maid go still is to let them die slowly with their eyes open. Better, said Marun Ist, to be gentle and quick and begin again. And he was not a monster. He had signed the same document 11 times in his career, and had wept exactly 0 times and slept perfectly well. And I do not think he ever once considered the possibility that he had spent his life being wrong about what a person is. The date was set for the 8th of the Ember fast. I was to attend, as keeper of the table, because there is a rite, and the rite involves a table, and I had ordered the settings. 6 days before, the Empress sent for me. She received me in the gallery above the West Solar, which was not a room for receiving anybody. She was at the rail. Below us, the boy sat on the rug in the last of the afternoon light with his back to us and his hands loose on his knees, and he had not moved in the hour I stood there, and he did not move in the hour after. "Keeper," she said. "Majesty." She did not turn around. She said, "You dismissed a servant in the 7th month." I felt the floor tilt very slightly, the way it does in age. "A human, Majesty, of the low kitchen." "Yes," her hands on the rail, one laid over the other, the crystal thread whispering as she breathed. "Warden Seth tells me that in the 11th week my son laughed." I did not know that. I have never known what to do with the fact that I did not know that. "He was found," I said, "in the kitchens with the human, eating." "Eating?" she said. "Yes, Majesty." "What did he eat?" I stood in that gallery, keeper of the table of Senaris, master of 411 precedences, and my mouth was a dry hole, and I said, "Barley soup, Majesty, and bread." The human tore it for him. And Empress Ilvarin the younger turned around, and her face, which did nothing ever at all, was wet, and she said in the flattest voice I have ever heard from a living creature, "Nobody has ever torn bread for my son." Then she said, "What did the human do that 9 physicians could not?" And I heard myself say it, and it came out of me like a stone out of a wall. "He set out a second bowl, Majesty, and he pulled out a chair." She was quiet for a long time. Below us the boy sat. "Find him," she said. It took 2 days. He was on the 3rd dock, cooking a stew of fish heads and beans for 80 men in a shed with a canvas roof, and Captain Orun took 11 guards in imperial gray, which was, I have always thought, an unnecessary number for one cook, and the dockhand stood up all along the benches when the guards came in. Corliss put his spoon down. Orun's report says he asked, "Is the kid all right?" before anyone had said a word to him. Orun, who was not a warm man, said, "No." And the human took his apron off and hung it on a nail and said to the man beside him, "Merit, it wants 10 more minutes and don't let it catch on the bottom," and picked up his pot and his spoon and walked out to the carriage. They brought him up the hill at dusk. I met him in the kitchen court because I could not bring myself to be anywhere else, and he came out of that carriage with his canvas roll under his arm, and he saw me, and I saw him understand instantly that I was the one who had done it, and that I was also the one who had sent for him. I had prepared a great deal to say. I had ranked and ordered it. Some of it was almost an apology. He said, "Where is he?" "The West Solar," I said. "He is cook, he is very far gone. He is to be unmade in 4 days. I must tell you honestly that I do not think." "Has anybody fed him?" I said with the last of the man I used to be, "The maid are sustained by draught. They do not." And Nate Corliss, 33 years old, colony-born, no character, no reference, standing in the kitchen court of the palace of Senaris with a chipped pot under his arm, looked up at me with those whetstone eyes and said, without any heat at all, which was worse, "Sir, he told me he doesn't like the fat on it." The convocation would not allow it in the West Solar. There was a great deal of argument, most of it about contamination, some of it about precedence, and one memorable half-hour about whether a human might be permitted to hold a spoon in the presence of the heir, conducted while while the heir sat 4 floors above us with the light going out of him. It was the Empress who ended it. She said, "Then we will go down to the kitchen." There is no protocol for an Empress in a kitchen. I know, because I am the man who would have had to have written it. They carried the boy down the servant's stair on a chair, because he could not walk, and they set him in the doorway of the low kitchen, and behind him came the Empress of the Vessine Ascendancy in crystal thread and pale silver, and behind her the high physician Marun Ist with his hands full of instruments he would not use, and Warden Seth, and 2 of the 9, and Captain Orun and myself. We filled the doorway and the stair behind it. Vessine faces, 20 of them, lavender and silver in the dark, the glow of our eyes in a stairwell like a hold full of lamps. And in the middle of the room, with his back to us, the human was cooking. He had come down an hour early. He had banked the fire and cleaned the hearth and put on his own pot, the chipped one, and he had barley in it and an onion and a bone, and the whole room smelled of it, which is a smell I had walked through 10,000 times in 60 years and never once smelled. He did not turn around when we came in. He said over his shoulder in a completely ordinary voice, "It's about 10 minutes off. You can wait there or you can sit down, but I'd sit down. It's a long 10 minutes standing." Nobody sat down. He skimmed the fat. He did it slowly, with the oak spoon, tapping it on the rim, and the tap of wood on enamel was the only sound in that room, and behind me on the stair I heard one of the 9 breathe out through his nose. Then he came around the table, wiping his hands on his apron, and he crouched down on his heels in front of the chair in the doorway, so that his eyes were below the boy's eyes, and he said, "Hey Tayan." The boy did not move. Marun Ist said, "He does not respond to auditory." "I know," said the cook, not unkindly, not looking at him. "Give me a minute." He said, "I've got a job for you and I can't do it myself on account of I've got hands like feet. Somebody's got to stir that pot, slow, not beating it, you remember." "Nothing." He said, "I never finished the bread that night. It's still on my mind. You started it and I never finished it, and that's been sitting wrong with me for 4 months because you tore that dough out and it was good and it went in the bin, and all that time went in the bin with it, and you know how I feel about that." Nothing. The boy's eyes were open. The room was very hot and very quiet, and my hands, I discovered, were shaking so badly that the tally book was making a noise, and I put it down on the floor. And Nate Corliss took his oak spoon, the dark one, worn oval on the left, the one he had gone into a waste bin to the shoulders for, and he put the handle of it into the boy's slack hand, and closed the boy's fingers over it with his own broad scarred hand, and held them there. He said quietly, "Nobody's going to make you. You want to or you don't. Both are fine. But I set your bowl out and I'm not eating till you do, and I'm hungry, kid." There was 1 full second. Then the fingers of the Prince of the Vessine tightened on the spoon. I heard the Empress make a sound behind me. It was not a word. In 61 years of service, I had heard that woman produce 300 perfect sentences and never one sound, and this was a sound, and I have carried it since. The boy came up off the chair. He was very weak. He went down on 1 knee on the brick, and the cook did not catch him, and I understood in that moment, dimly, that not catching him was the hardest thing that man did in his whole life, and that he did it because the boy needed to stand up more than he needed to be caught. And Tayan got his feet under himself, and walked, and got up on the crate at the hearth the way he had done 100 times, and put the spoon in the pot and stirred. Slow, not beating it. His mother stood 4 paces behind him, with both her hands over her mouth. He stirred for a long time. Nobody in that kitchen moved, and the fire ticked, and the human went and got 2 bowls down from the shelf and set them on the long scarred table, 1 at each end of the lamplight, and pulled out a chair. Then he stopped. He looked at the doorway, at the Empress of the Vessine Ascendancy standing in a kitchen in a gown worth a province, with her son's back to her. And he went and got a third bowl and set it in the middle, and pulled out the chair beside it. He said, "Ma'am, are you hungry? I have attended 11 coronations. I saw the surrender of the Marrow Belt. I have stood in rooms where the fate of 9 worlds was decided by men who did not raise their voices. I have never seen anything in my life like the Empress Ilverin crossing that brick floor." She sat down. She sat on a servant's bench with her back straight and her hands in her lap. The cook ladled soup for the boy first, then for her, then for himself last, which is a thing I have thought about ever since. And he tore the bread with his hands and put a piece by each bowl, and he sat down at the end of the table and picked up his spoon and began to eat. Because you do not watch a person eat. And the boy came off the crate and got up on the chair between them, and picked up his bowl in both hands, and drank from the rim of it like a farm child, with the soup running down his chin. And his mother reached over, across the protocol of 11 generations, across the college of the inner sea, across the quiet rooms and the reed of soft glass and the graph that hangs on the wall, and wiped his chin with her thumb. That was the first time Empress Ilverin, the younger, ever touched her son. Behind me on the stair, High Physician Marun Ist said, in a small cracked voice, to nobody, "He is eating." And I turned around and looked at him and understood that the man had spent 40 years growing children in glass rooms and had never in that time sat down to a meal with one. The unmaking was struck from the calendar the same night. It required a vote, and the vote was 9-0, and no one spoke during it, and afterward 2 of the 9 went out into the cold court and stood there for a long while. The next morning the convocation ordered a full review of the quiet rooms, and it took 11 years and it changed the ascendancy. And I have no intention of writing that history, because it has been written by better minds, and every one of them begins in a kitchen with a bowl of barley soup, and every one of them gets the cook's name wrong at least once. They offered him things. Understand that this was the correct behavior. This is what we do. A man who has done the state a service is elevated, and the elevation is the proof that the state has noticed, and I myself drew up the list, in my own hand, with real pleasure, at 2 in the morning, the way you write when you are trying to make a thing right that cannot be made right. Cook to the imperial table, a house in the lower city, his wage restored fourfold and backdated, his contract voided and replaced with a freehold, passage for his sister and her family if he wished it, and land. I brought the paper down to the low kitchen myself, and he read it slowly, moving his lips, because his reading was poor and he never pretended otherwise. Then he put it on the table and smoothed it flat with one hand, the way he smoothed a cloth. He said, "The sister thing, can I have that one and leave the rest?" I said, "Cook, because she's got 2 boys and the ground freezes." Cook the imperial table. Do you understand what is being offered? You would cook for the Empress. And he looked around the low kitchen, the scorched brick, the bad chimney he had cleaned himself, the long scarred table, the 200 servants who ate at it, and he said, with an expression of mild embarrassment, as though I had asked him something faintly indecent, "The pot's down here, sir." He would not take the house. He would not take the fourfold wage. He took the ordinary one, restored, and he took the passage for his sister, and stood in the port shed when she came off the transport and let her cry on his shirt, and her 2 boys grew up in the lower city, and one of them is a physician now and the other builds bridges. He asked for exactly 2 things, and I wrote them both down, and they are in the household record where the historians can never find them because they are filed under kitchen requisitions. The first was a larger pot because, he said, "There's more of us now." The second was that the door at the bottom of the servants' stair be left unlocked at night. I will finish this quickly, because the rest of it is 30 years long, and it belongs to the boy and not to me. Tayan ate. He ate everything for about a year in the way of children who have discovered a door, and he got heavy, and then he got tall, and he learned to knock on the bottom of a loaf and listen for the hollow sound, and he learned to lean on dough and push it away from himself. And he was a very bad cook and remained one all his life, which delighted him. He came down the servants' stair almost every night for 6 years. Then less. Then in the way of these things on some nights, and then on certain nights. And then he was emperor, and he came down on the 8th of the Ember fast every year, and put on an apron over the imperial thread and stood on the brick where the crate used to be, and skimmed the fat badly, while a broad old human sat on the bench and told him he was beating it, not stirring it. He was invested at 15. At the ceremony, the rite requires the heir to say the sentence the maid are given in the quiet rooms, the small formality about being ready to serve, and he stood up in front of the 411 houses and said instead, in that flat vessing voice, "My name is Tan. I was hungry, and one person noticed." And then he sat down, and the convocation of 9 had to invent a protocol in the middle of a coronation, and I loved him. And I was 79 years old and had never once in my life used that word about anybody. Nate Corliss died in his bed in the lower city at 68, with his sister's grandchildren in the room and the emperor of the Vessine ascendancy sitting on the floor beside him, because there was no chair and Tayan would not let them bring one in case the noise woke him. The spoon is in the low kitchen. It is not in a case. That was the emperor's instruction, and there was a great deal of trouble about it, because a relic of the imperial house cannot simply lie in a drawer with the other spoons, and the emperor said that a spoon that cannot be used is not a spoon. It is a picture of a spoon, and he said this with such uncharacteristic heat that the master of relics went pale, and the matter was closed. So it lies in the drawer. The undercooks use it. It is worn oval on the left side because he stirred left-handed, and the handle has a shine on it like a stair rail in an old house. I am 94. I have given up the table. My hands shake and my eyes have gone dim at the corners, which is the beginning of the long dimming, and I am not much afraid of it. But on the nights when I cannot sleep, I still go down the servants' stair, slowly, one step at a time with a lamp. And I sit in the low kitchen where the chimney draws clean, and I put the pot on, and there is nobody left in that room who needs feeding, nobody at all, and I set 2 bowls out on the long scarred table anyway. I pull out the second chair. Then I sit down and I do not begin, and I listen for a boy on the stairs.